I remember the basement that Tuesday evening like it was a photograph I've studied too many times. The air was thick with the scent of detergent and fabric softener, that artificial cleanliness that somehow made everything feel more closed in. The washing machine hummed its familiar rhythm against the far wall, a sound I had grown so accustomed to that it had become the soundtrack to my solitude. I was folding shirts. White dress shirts, mostly. The kind I wore to the insurance office every day, pressed and starched into submission. My hands moved automatically, creasing the sleeves with the same precision I had learned from my mother decades before. Fold the sleeves back. Smooth the wrinkles. Stack them neat and even. There was something hypnotic about it, the way routine could make time disappear. Above the dryer sat our family photo, the one Evelyn had insisted we take last Christmas. The glass was dusty now, ignored but still watching. For faces smiling back at me from behind that thin layer of neglect. I caught myself avoiding looking at it directly, the way you might avoid meeting your own eyes in a mirror when you're not ready for what you might see there. The footsteps on the basement stairs broke through the machine's monotone hum. I knew the sound immediately. Gabriel's steps were heavier than Evelyn's, more deliberate than the kids'. He always took the stairs slowly, as if he was giving you time to prepare for his presence. I felt something shift in my chest, a small electric current that I told myself was just surprise. He appeared at the bottom of the steps with his own laundry basket balanced against his hip. Gabriel had always been careful about these things, never assuming he was welcome, always asking permission with his presence before fully entering a space. Even after all these years of being neighbors, of shared barbecues and borrowed tools, he maintained this gentle distance that somehow made him feel both familiar and untouchable. "We need to fix your dryer," he said, setting his basket down near mine. "It's been cutting out again." I nodded and reached for another shirt from my pile. My hands were steady, but something underneath my skin felt restless. Gabriel moved to the other side of the folding table, and we fell into an easy rhythm. This wasn't the first time we had shared this space. Over the past few months, our laundry schedules had somehow synchronized, creating these quiet moments where we worked side by side without much need for conversation. But tonight felt different. There was a charge in the air that I couldn't name, something that made me hyper-aware of his movements, of the space between us. When he reached across the table for a towel, his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, really. The kind of accidental contact that happens a dozen times a day between any two people sharing a task. But I felt it travel up my arm like a spark, and I found myself looking up to meet his eyes. He was already looking at me, not just glancing, but really looking, with an intensity that made my breath catch. For a moment that felt both endless and instant, we stayed like that, connected by something I had no words for. His eyes were the color of coffee, warm and dark, and there was something in them I had never allowed myself to notice before. I looked away first, my hands fumbling with the shirt I was trying to fold. The fabric seemed to resist me now, clumsy and uncooperative. Gabriel continued working as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the weight of that moment settling over us like dust on an old photograph. The washing machine clicked off, and the sudden silence felt enormous. I realized my hands were trembling slightly as I smoothed down the collar of another shirt. Something had shifted in this basement, in this space I had always thought of as mine alone. What had once been simply a chore, a necessary task to keep our lives running smoothly, now felt like something else entirely. Like an altar where something I couldn't name had been quietly, irreversibly revealed. I was 46 that year, though I felt both older and younger than that number suggested. Older in the way that routine ages you, wearing down your edges until you become smooth and unremarkable. Younger in the way that unlived possibilities can preserve something raw and unfinished inside you, waiting. Our house sat in the middle of Maple Street, like a catalog photograph of suburban contentment. Evelyn had chosen the paint colors, the landscaping, the careful arrangement of throw pillows that made everything look intentional and warm. She had a gift for creating the appearance of home, and I had learned to live inside that appearance as if it were real. The dinner table conversations followed predictable rhythms. Emma, our 17-year-old, would update us on college applications and friend drama with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that information sharing was the price of peace. Michael, 2 years older and already drifting toward his own independence, offered just enough engagement to avoid concern. Evelyn would fill the spaces between with updates about her volunteer work, neighborhood news, plans for weekend errands that required my participation. I would nod and respond appropriately, playing my role as husband and father with the same competence I brought to folding laundry. But underneath the surface of these ordinary moments, I felt like I was slowly suffocating on the very air I was supposed to be grateful to breathe. My days were measured in spreadsheets and conference calls at the insurance firm where I had worked for 18 years. Senior claims analyst, though the senior part felt more like an acknowledgement of time served than any particular expertise. I processed other people's disasters from a beige cubicle, translating their worst moments into policy numbers and settlement amounts. There was something fitting about it, I thought sometimes. I had become an expert in calculating the cost of things falling apart. The commute home gave me 43 minutes to transition between versions of myself. 43 minutes to lock away whatever restlessness stirred during the day and prepare to be the man my family expected to find when I walked through the front door. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had usually succeeded in convincing myself that this dissatisfaction was normal, that everyone felt this particular flavor of emptiness that came with middle age and middle management and middle-class contentment. Evelyn and I had been married for 22 years, long enough that we moved around each other with the careful choreography of people who had learned to share space without friction. She folded laundry in the living room while watching her evening shows, her movements efficient and practical. I noticed how we had stopped talking during these tasks, how silence had become easier than the effort of finding something new to say. In bed, we slept back to back, a careful distance maintained even in sleep. The intimacy that had once felt natural between us had gradually cooled into something more like a business partnership. We managed the household, raised the children, maintained the mortgage and the social obligations and the yard work. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped reaching for each other in the dark. I told myself this was what marriage became after 2 decades, that passion was a young person's luxury, that contentment was actually a more mature way to love. But in the quiet moments, usually in that basement with the rhythm of the washing machine covering the sound of my thoughts, I wondered if I had confused resignation with acceptance. The basement became my sanctuary, the one place in the house where I could exist without performance. Surrounded by baskets of clothes and the mechanical sounds of cleaning, I found a strange peace in the repetitive work. There was something honest about laundry, about the simple transformation of dirty things becoming clean, wrinkled things becoming smooth. The irony wasn't lost on me that surrounded by all that fabric, all those textures and weaves, I was the one who felt threadbare, as if the essential parts of me had been worn thin by years of careful washing, until what remained was serviceable but somehow less substantial than it had once been. Across the street, Gabriel lived alone in a house that was the mirror image of ours, but felt entirely different. I had been inside it only a few times over the years, usually for neighborhood gatherings or to help with some repair that required an extra pair of hands. Where our house felt carefully curated for family life, his felt quietly chosen for one person's comfort. There were books stacked on tables, art on the walls that seemed selected for personal meaning rather than decorative effect. Gabriel had been divorced for nearly a decade, his children grown and living in other cities. He worked from home, doing something with graphic design that allowed him to keep irregular hours and maintain the kind of solitude that I found myself envying more than I cared to admit. He had a way of moving through the world that seemed both settled and open, as if he had made peace with who he was but remained curious about who he might still become. Sometimes, usually when I was loading the dishwasher after dinner while Evelyn helped Emma with college essays, I would catch sight of him through the kitchen window. He would be reading on his back porch or tending to the small garden he maintained along his fence line. There was something about his solitude that didn't look lonely, and I found myself wondering what that kind of peace with yourself might feel like. I told myself that my awareness of Gabriel was simply the natural attention neighbors pay to each other's routines. But in the basement, folding clothes in the mechanical rhythm that had become my meditation, I sometimes caught myself thinking about the way he laughed during neighborhood conversations, or how his presence could make even mundane interactions feel somehow more alive. These thoughts would surface and disappear like bubbles in water, too quick and insubstantial to examine closely. But they were there, adding something to the texture of my days that I didn't yet have words to describe. It was a Thursday evening in early October when Evelyn changed everything with a single, casual request. She was loading the dishwasher, her movements automatic and efficient, when she mentioned that Gabriel had been having trouble with his dryer again. "It keeps shutting off mid-cycle," she said, not looking up from the plates she was arranging in the rack. "Maybe you could take a look at it tomorrow evening? You know how these things work better than most people." I nodded from my position at the kitchen counter, where I was sorting through the day's mail with the same mindless attention I brought to most evening routines. It seemed like such a small thing, the kind of neighborly favor that had passed between our households dozens of times over the years. Gabriel had helped me repair our fence after the storm last spring. I had lent him my ladder when he needed to clean his gutters. This was simply how neighborhoods functioned, the quiet reciprocity that made living in proximity to other people bearable. But as I walked across the street the following evening, carrying a small toolbox that probably contained nothing useful for dryer repair, I felt an unusual nervousness in my chest. Something about stepping into Gabriel's space felt different than our basement encounters, more intentional and less accidentally intimate. He answered the door wearing jeans and a gray sweater that made his dark eyes seem even warmer than usual. There was something about seeing him in his own environment that struck me as unexpectedly vulnerable, as if I was being allowed access to a version of him that the rest of the neighborhood never saw. The inside of his house surprised me with its understated warmth. Where our home felt carefully arranged for the impression it would make on visitors, Gabriel's space seemed chosen purely for his own comfort and pleasure. The lighting was soft, coming from table lamps rather than the harsh overhead fixtures that dominated our rooms. Framed prints and photographs covered the walls, not the generic landscapes and family portraits that decorated most suburban homes, but images that seemed personally meaningful in ways I couldn't quite decipher. The dryer was in a small laundry closet off his kitchen, and it took only a few minutes to identify the problem. A loose connection in the exhaust vent was causing the machine to overheat and trigger its safety shutoff. I tightened the clamp and tested the airflow, conscious of Gabriel standing close enough behind me that I could smell his soap, something clean and masculine that made me feel slightly dizzy. When I stood up and announced that it should work properly now, Gabriel insisted on making coffee to thank me. He moved around his kitchen with an easy familiarity, pulling mugs from cabinets and measuring grounds with the confidence of someone who had perfected his routine through years of living alone. I found myself studying his hands as he worked, noting the way his fingers curved around the coffee scoop, the careful precision with which he leveled each measurement. We sat at his small dining table, and what I had expected to be a brief, polite conversation stretched into something much deeper. Gabriel had always been easy to talk to, but tonight there was something different in the quality of his attention. He asked questions that went beyond the surface of things, and when I answered, he listened with the kind of focus that made me feel like my words actually mattered. We talked about the neighborhood first, the way it had changed over the years as families moved in and out. Children grew up and left, couples divorced or grew old together. But gradually, the conversation shifted toward more personal territory. Gabriel mentioned how quiet his house had become since his divorce, not in a way that suggested loneliness, but as an observation about the different textures of solitude. I found myself talking about work in ways I never did at home, describing the strange melancholy of processing other people's disasters day after day, the way it had begun to color how I saw the world. Gabriel nodded with understanding, sharing his own experience of working alone, the way isolation could become either a refuge or a prison depending on your relationship with yourself. Somehow, as the evening stretched past 9 and then past 10, we ended up talking about loneliness. Not the dramatic kind that comes from crisis or loss, but the quiet, persistent variety that can grow inside a life that looks perfectly adequate from the outside. Gabriel spoke about it with a candor that disarmed me, describing the particular challenge of being alone by choice, but not immune to the human need for connection. I told him things I had never said out loud to anyone, about the feeling of being surrounded by my family, but somehow still isolated, about the way routine had become both my comfort and my cage, about the strange sensation of living a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had made all the right choices, but somehow ended up in the wrong story. When Gabriel reached across the table to refill my coffee mug, our hands brushed as I moved to steady the cup. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent something electric up my arm and straight into my chest. I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something soft and complicated that made my heart race in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The conversation continued, but underneath it now was an awareness of that moment, that brief contact that had felt like more than accidental touch. I found myself hyper-aware of Gabriel's proximity, the way the lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the sound of his voice when he spoke quietly about things that mattered to him. When I finally looked at the clock, it was nearly midnight. I apologized for staying so late, but Gabriel waved away my concern with a smile that suggested he had enjoyed the evening as much as I had. He walked me to the door, and we stood there for a moment in the awkward space between staying and leaving, neither of us quite ready to end what had felt like an unusually honest conversation. I walked home across the dark street, feeling strangely awakened, as if something in me that had been dormant for years had suddenly stirred to life. Inside my own house, everything looked exactly the same, but I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. The careful arrangements, the family photographs, the evidence of our shared life together seemed suddenly fragile, like a stage set that could be dismantled and rearranged. Evelyn was already asleep when I slipped into bed beside her. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened in Gabriel's kitchen. The memory of his hand brushing mine played over and over in my mind. Such a small thing, but somehow enormous in its implications. I told myself I was reading too much into a simple gesture, that the strange electricity I had felt was just the result of an unusually personal conversation with someone I barely knew despite years of living across the street from each other. But even as I tried to rationalize the feeling away, I could feel it humming just beneath my skin like a current I couldn't turn off. Something had shifted tonight, something that I suspected couldn't be shifted back. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I found myself already anticipating the next time I might have an excuse to visit Gabriel's house, already planning what I might say to extend our conversation into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. For the first time in years, I fell asleep feeling genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. The excuses began innocently enough, the way most dangerous things do. 3 days after that evening in Gabriel's kitchen, I mentioned to Evelyn that our washing machine had developed a concerning rattle during the spin cycle. It wasn't entirely untrue. There was a slight vibration that I had been ignoring for months, the kind of minor mechanical complaint that most people learn to live with until it becomes a real problem. But now, suddenly, it seemed urgent. I told Evelyn I was worried about the machine damaging our clothes, about the noise disturbing the neighbors. She suggested I call a repair service, but I said I wanted to research the problem first, maybe try washing a few loads elsewhere until I could figure out what was wrong. Gabriel's dryer, meanwhile, continued its pattern of intermittent shutdowns despite my repair work. He mentioned this casually when we encountered each other at our mailboxes, and I offered to take another look at it. Perhaps there was a deeper issue that required ongoing attention, I suggested. These older machines could be temperamental, requiring patience and repeated adjustments to function properly. And so our laundry began to migrate. First, I carried a small load of work shirts across the street, telling myself this was simply a practical solution to a mechanical problem. Gabriel welcomed me with the same easy warmth he had shown that night over coffee, helping me sort the clothes and start the washer as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. When the wash cycle finished, it seemed logical to move the clothes to his dryer, which meant staying to ensure everything dried properly. Gabriel suggested we fold the laundry together in his basement, which was cooler and more comfortable than waiting upstairs in the heat of his kitchen. His basement was different from ours. Where our underground space felt utilitarian and slightly oppressive, Gabriel's had been transformed into something more welcoming. He had installed better lighting, painted the concrete walls a warm cream color, and arranged the laundry area with the same attention to comfort that characterized the rest of his house. A small radio sat on a shelf between bottles of detergent, playing jazz so quietly it was almost subliminal. We established a rhythm quickly, working on opposite sides of a folding table he had set up beneath the soft overhead lighting. The conversation flowed as easily as it had that night in his kitchen, but now it was punctuated by the comfortable sounds of domestic work. The snap of fabric being shaken out, the soft thud of folded clothes being stacked, the gentle background hum of the dryer completing its cycle. What struck me most was how natural this felt, how the simple act of working beside Gabriel seemed to unlock something in me that I hadn't realized was locked away. At home, household tasks felt like obligations to be completed as efficiently as possible. Here, folding laundry became something closer to meditation, a shared quiet that allowed for the kind of conversation that rarely happened in the rush of ordinary life. Gabriel talked about his past with a candor that both shocked and captivated me. Not all at once, but gradually, over the course of several evenings spent in his basement, he began to share pieces of his story that I suspected few people had ever heard. He spoke about relationships that had mattered to him, connections that had been forced into hiding by circumstances, and expectations that seemed archaic now but had felt insurmountable at the time. He told me about David, a college roommate who had become something more during their senior year, a relationship that had to be conducted in absolute secrecy and had ultimately been abandoned when graduation forced them into different cities and different lives. He described the particular pain of loving someone you could never acknowledge publicly, of having to pretend that the person who meant everything to you was just a friend. There had been others over the years, he said, men who had drifted in and out of his life like shadows, relationships that existed in the margins of a world that wasn't ready to see them clearly. Even after his divorce, even after the social restrictions had loosened somewhat, Gabriel had found it difficult to trust the possibility of something open and honest. The habit of secrecy had become so ingrained that he sometimes wondered if he was still capable of love that didn't require hiding. I listened to these stories with a fascination that went beyond mere curiosity. Something in Gabriel's words resonated with a frequency I felt in my own chest, a recognition that I couldn't yet name but couldn't ignore. As he spoke about the silences he had kept to survive, about the parts of himself he had learned to bury so deeply that he sometimes forgot they existed, I found myself nodding with an understanding that surprised us both. Gradually, I began to share my own version of concealment. Not the same kind of secret that Gabriel had carried, but a different form of self-suppression that felt equally heavy. I talked about the hollowness that had grown inside my marriage, the way Evelyn and I had become expert at avoiding the deeper questions about what we actually wanted from each other and from our lives. I described the particular ache of years lived in restraint, of waking up every morning and putting on a version of myself that felt increasingly foreign. The successful suburban father, the reliable husband, the competent middle manager, all roles that I performed adequately, but that had begun to feel like costumes I couldn't take off. Gabriel listened with the same generous attention I had tried to give his stories, asking questions that helped me articulate feelings I had never spoken aloud. He seemed to understand the specific loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who love a version of you that isn't quite real, the exhaustion of maintaining a performance that has become indistinguishable from your identity. As these conversations deepened, I became aware of a growing charge in the physical space between us. The basement that had initially felt neutral, simply a convenient place to do laundry, began to take on a different quality. Every gesture became loaded with meaning. The way Gabriel handed me a shirt to fold, the careful distance he maintained when moving around the table, the moments when our eyes met over a basket of towels. One evening, as I was struggling to fold a fitted sheet, Gabriel stepped around the table to help me. He took two corners while I held the other two, and we moved through the familiar dance of bringing the corners together. But when our hands met, when his fingers brushed mine as we aligned the fabric, neither of us pulled away immediately. We stood there, holding the sheet between us, our hands touching over the soft cotton. The contact was innocent enough, the kind of brief connection that happens naturally when two people work together on a simple task. But the way Gabriel's eyes met mine, the way his fingers lingered against my knuckles for just a moment longer than necessary, transformed the gesture into something else entirely. The air between us felt thick, charged with something I had no experience navigating. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel heat rising in my face as we finally separated and finished folding the sheet in careful silence. These moments began to accumulate, Gabriel passing me a bottle of detergent and letting his hand rest against mine as I took it. The brush of his shoulder against my back as he reached for something on the shelf behind me. Small contacts that could have been accidental but felt increasingly intentional, as if we were both testing the boundaries of what was permissible between us. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday evening in late October. We had been working in comfortable quiet, the radio playing something soft and melancholy, when Gabriel needed to reach past me for a towel that had fallen behind the dryer. Instead of asking me to move, or waiting for me to notice and step aside, he simply reached across, his body briefly pinning me between his chest and the warm metal of the machine. For a moment that felt both endless and instantaneous, I was completely enclosed by his presence. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could smell the familiar scent of his soap mixed with something uniquely him. His arm brushed against my shoulder as he retrieved the towel, and I felt the solid weight of his body against my back. It was the most intimate contact I had experienced with another person in years, and it sent something electric through my entire body. Every nerve seemed to wake up at once, as if I had been sleepwalking through my physical existence and had suddenly, violently, been jolted awake. But even as every instinct urged me to lean back into that warmth, to turn around and face whatever was happening between us, I panicked. The weight of 22 years of marriage, of 2 children, of a life built on assumptions I had never questioned, crashed down on me like a wave. I pulled away so quickly that I nearly knocked over the basket of clothes beside me. Gabriel stepped back immediately, his face flushing with what might have been embarrassment or apology. Neither of us spoke. The moment hung between us, enormous and awkward and impossible to pretend hadn't happened. I fumbled with the towel I was supposed to be folding, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to focus on the simple task of making neat creases in terry cloth. We finished the laundry in silence, the easy conversation that had become our ritual replaced by a tension that made every movement feel deliberate and strange. When I finally gathered my clothes and prepared to leave, Gabriel walked me to the door as he always did, but something fundamental had changed between us. As I crossed the street back to my own house, my chest was burning with something I couldn't name and couldn't ignore. The brief pressure of Gabriel's body against mine had awakened something that I wasn't sure I could put back to sleep. I felt like a fault line had opened somewhere inside me, and I had no idea how deep the crack might go or what might fall into it. Inside my own house, everything looked exactly the same. Evelyn was reading in the living room, her book balanced on her lap, her reading glasses catching the light from the table lamp. The children were upstairs, probably doing homework or talking to friends online. The familiar sounds of our evening routine hummed around me like a lullaby I had been hearing for so long I had stopped noticing the melody. But I felt like a stranger in this space that I had helped create and maintain for more than 2 decades. The man who belonged in this house, who fit seamlessly into this life, seemed like someone I had been impersonating for so long that I had forgotten it was a performance. That night, lying in bed beside Evelyn with our customary distance preserved even in sleep, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to me. The memory of Gabriel's presence, of that moment when his body had been pressed against mine, played over and over in my mind with an intensity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I told myself it had been an accident, a simple case of two people trying to share a small space and briefly getting in each other's way. But even as I tried to minimize what had happened, I knew that something irrevocable had shifted. The careful boundaries I had maintained, the comfortable distance I had preserved between myself and any desires that might complicate my life, had been breached. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I fell asleep feeling completely awake. I stayed away from the basement for 6 days after that evening, terrified of what might happen if I allowed myself to be alone with Gabriel again. The excuse I gave Evelyn was that our washing machine seemed to be working better now, that whatever problem I had been concerned about appeared to have resolved itself. She accepted this explanation with the same mild interest she brought to most household maintenance issues, and life resumed its familiar patterns. But underneath the surface of normalcy, I felt like I was coming apart. The memory of Gabriel's body against mine had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest, and no amount of routine could dislodge it. I found myself distracted during meetings at work, losing track of conversations mid-sentence as my mind drifted back to that moment in his basement. At dinner, I caught myself staring out the kitchen window toward his house, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking about what had happened between us. The physical absence of our laundry ritual left a gap in my week that felt disproportionately large. Thursday evenings, which had become our unspoken appointment, now stretched empty and strange. I tried to fill the time with other activities, volunteering to help Emma with her college applications, offering to take on more of the household tasks that Evelyn usually handled. But nothing could replace the particular peace I had found in Gabriel's basement, the sense of being able to exist without performance or pretense. Gabriel, to his credit, didn't push. He didn't appear at my door with questions or excuses for contact. When we encountered each other while checking our mailboxes or taking out trash, he was as warm and neighborly as he had always been. But there was something careful in his manner now, a respect for the distance I was trying to maintain. It was this restraint, paradoxically, that made his eventual gesture so devastating. I found the shirt on my front porch on a Thursday evening, exactly a week after our last basement encounter. It was folded with the same precise care I had learned to recognize in Gabriel's work, placed on the small table beside our front door where packages were sometimes left. There was no note, no explanation, just a single white dress shirt that I recognized as one of mine, something that must have gotten mixed in with his laundry during one of our shared folding sessions. The gesture was simple, practical even. He was just returning something that belonged to me. But as I stood there holding the shirt, feeling the warmth it had retained from his hands, I understood that this was also something else entirely. An acknowledgement of what had passed between us, a quiet statement that he remembered our evenings together and what they had meant to both of us. I looked around quickly to see if any neighbors were watching, then carried the shirt inside and straight upstairs to the bedroom I shared with Evelyn. She was downstairs helping Michael with something on his computer, and I could hear their voices floating up from the living room, normal and domestic, and utterly unaware of the crisis unfolding in their midst. Alone in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and held Gabriel's careful fold against my chest. The fabric still carried traces of his detergent, his softener, the particular scent of his house that I had grown to associate with those evenings of honest conversation and comfortable work. But more than that, it carried the weight of his attention, the knowledge that he had handled this shirt with the same gentle precision he brought to everything, thinking of me as he smoothed the wrinkles and aligned the seams. I pressed the fabric to my face, breathing in the scent of it, and felt something break open inside me. All the careful control I had maintained over the past week, all the rational explanations I had constructed for what was happening between us, crumbled in the face of this simple, intimate gesture. I began to tremble, not from cold or fear exactly, but from the overwhelming recognition of how much I had been denying myself, how much I had been hiding even from my own awareness. For 22 years, I had convinced myself that the hollow feeling in my chest was normal, that everyone felt this particular kind of loneliness within their marriages, that contentment was the most mature form of love. But holding Gabriel's shirt, surrounded by the evidence of the life I had built with Evelyn, I finally understood that what I had been calling contentment was actually a kind of slow suffocation. I stayed in that bedroom for nearly an hour, holding the shirt and crying quietly, trying to understand what was happening to me. When I finally composed myself enough to go back downstairs, Evelyn looked up from her magazine and asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was just tired, maybe coming down with something. She suggested I go to bed early, offered to make me tea, and I accepted her kindness while feeling like the worst kind of fraud. It took me 3 more days to find the courage to cross the street again. Gabriel answered his door as if he had been expecting me, which perhaps he had been. His face showed relief mixed with something that might have been nervousness, and I realized that my absence had been as difficult for him as it had been for me. We didn't discuss the shirt directly. Instead, I mentioned that I had a few items that probably belonged to him, things that had gotten mixed up in our shared laundry sessions. He nodded and invited me in, and we made our way down to his basement as if this were just another ordinary evening. But nothing about that night felt ordinary. The weight of everything unspoken hung between us like a physical presence as we went through the motions of sorting and folding. The conversation that had always flowed so easily between us felt stilted now, punctuated by long silences that grew more uncomfortable as the evening wore on. Finally, as we were finishing the last load, I couldn't bear the pretense anymore. Gabriel was folding a towel with his usual methodical care, and I was watching his hands work, remembering the way those same hands had touched mine, the way his body had felt pressed against my back. The weight of everything I wasn't saying felt like it was crushing me. "I can't keep pretending," I whispered, the words coming out so quietly I wasn't sure he had heard them. He looked up from the towel, his dark eyes searching my face for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give him. But instead of asking what I meant, instead of forcing me to articulate what I was barely beginning to understand myself, he simply stepped closer. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving me time to pull away if I needed to. But I didn't move. I stood frozen as he approached, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When he was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, he reached up and touched my face with the same gentle precision he brought to folding laundry. Then he leaned forward until our foreheads were touching, a contact so tender and careful that it felt almost sacred. We stood like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, connected by this simple touch that somehow contained everything we had been unable to say to each other. That was when I broke down completely. 22 years of careful control, of managing appearances and maintaining expectations, collapsed all at once. I sobbed against Gabriel's shoulder, great gasping cries that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than I knew I could reach. All the loneliness I had convinced myself was normal, all the desires I had buried so thoroughly I had forgotten they existed, all the grief for the life I had never allowed myself to want, poured out of me in a rush that left me feeling completely emptied. Gabriel held me through it all, his arms steady and warm around my shaking body. He didn't try to quiet me or tell me everything would be all right. He just let me fall apart in his embrace, offering his presence as a safe place for this long overdue collapse. When the crying finally subsided, I found myself still pressed against his chest, listening to his heartbeat and trying to understand what had just happened to me. For the first time in decades, maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, I felt completely seen. Not the carefully managed version of myself that I presented to the world, but the raw, uncertain person I had been hiding underneath all the acceptable roles and responsibilities. The terror of what this recognition might cost me was overwhelming. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt like relief, so profound it was almost painful. After years of feeling like a stranger in my own life, I had finally encountered myself, and the recognition was both devastating and essential. The weeks that followed that evening in Gabriel's basement were the most difficult of my life. I existed in a state of constant division, moving between two completely different versions of myself with an exhaustion that went deeper than anything I had ever experienced. Upstairs, in the bright, familiar spaces of my family home, I continued to perform the role I had been playing for more than 2 decades. I sat at the dinner table and asked Emma about her college interviews, listened to Michael describe his plans for taking a gap year before starting university. I helped Evelyn plan our annual Thanksgiving menu, discussed whether we should replace the living room carpet before the holidays, maintained all the small conversations that keep a household functioning. But underneath this performance, I felt like I was slowly dissolving. Every interaction with my family required a conscious effort to remember who I was supposed to be in their presence, what responses were expected, what emotions I should display. The automatic nature of these relationships, which had once felt comforting, now felt like a prison I had built for myself, one careful brick at a time. Downstairs, in the basement that had become our sanctuary, Gabriel waited with infinite patience. We had not spoken directly about what had happened between us, about the breakdown that had left me sobbing in his arms, or the recognition that had followed. Instead, we continued our ritual of shared laundry and quiet conversation. But now every gesture carried the weight of what we both understood had changed between us. Gabriel's presence had become both my comfort and my torment. When I was with him, I felt like I could finally breathe fully, like I was inhabiting my own skin in a way I had forgotten was possible. But the knowledge that these moments were stolen, that each evening in his basement was a betrayal of the life I had promised to live upstairs, filled me with a guilt so intense it sometimes made me physically sick. I began to lose weight without meaning to, food becoming something I had to remind myself to consume rather than something I enjoyed. Sleep became elusive, my nights filled with the kind of restless anxiety that comes from knowing you are living a lie so fundamental that it touches every aspect of your existence. Evelyn noticed, in the way that wives notice changes in their husbands, but her concerns were practical. Perhaps I was working too hard, she suggested. Maybe I should see a doctor, get some blood work done, make sure nothing was wrong. The irony of her caring attention was almost unbearable. She was worried about my health, my well-being, my happiness, all while being completely unaware that the source of my distress was the life we had built together. Her kindness made everything worse, because it reminded me that she deserved better than a husband who had been lying to both of them for years about who he actually was. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early December. I had been spending more and more time in the basement, sometimes sitting there alone even when Gabriel wasn't available, just trying to find some space where I didn't have to pretend. On this particular evening, I had been down there for over 2 hours, ostensibly organizing our storage area, but actually just avoiding the dinner conversation happening upstairs. When Evelyn finally came looking for me, I was sitting on the concrete steps with my head in my hands, trying to summon the energy to go back upstairs and resume being a husband and father. She stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, and I could feel her studying me with the kind of careful attention that usually preceded difficult conversations. "You've been spending a lot of time down here lately," she said, her voice gentle but pointed. More than usual. I looked up at her, this woman who had shared my life for more than 2 decades, who had borne my children and managed our household and never asked for more than I had been able to give her. She was wearing the blue sweater I had bought her for her birthday, her hair pulled back in the practical style she preferred for evenings at home. She looked exactly like the person I had fallen in love with all those years ago, and exactly like a stranger whose life I had somehow become trapped inside. "I'm fine," I said, the automatic response that had become my default for any question that came too close to the truth. Just needed some quiet. But Evelyn had not stayed married to me for 22 years without learning to recognize when I was lying. She came down the stairs slowly, deliberately, and sat beside me on the step. The proximity felt both comforting and claustrophobic, a reminder of all the ways we had learned to care for each other and all the ways we had grown apart. "You're not fine," she said simply. "You haven't been fine for months. Whatever is happening with you, we need to talk about it." The word "we" hit me like a physical blow. There was no "we" that could contain what was happening to me. The crisis I was facing was so fundamentally solitary, so completely outside the framework of our marriage, that even attempting to share it felt like an act of violence. But I was so tired. Tired of maintaining the performance. Tired of the constant vigilance required to keep my two worlds separate. Tired of pretending that the person I was with Gabriel was somehow less real than the person I was with my family. The weight of the secret had become unbearable, and Evelyn's gentle insistence finally broke through whatever reserves of deception I had left. "I'm not who you think I am," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop them. "I'm not who I thought I was either." She waited for me to continue, her face showing the kind of careful composure that comes from sensing disaster approaching, but not yet understanding its shape. I realized that whatever I said next would change everything between us irreversibly, would shatter the illusion of our marriage in ways that could never be repaired. "I've been spending time with Gabriel," I said finally. "More than I should. More than a married man should." The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with the sound of 22 years of assumptions crumbling. Evelyn's face went through a series of expressions I had never seen before. Confusion giving way to understanding, and then to something that looked like grief. "Are you having an affair?" she asked, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "Not exactly," I said, which was both true and the most devastating possible answer. "It's not about sex. It's about—" I paused, trying to find words for something I barely understood myself. "It's about who I am when I'm with him. Who I've always been, maybe, but never let myself admit." The conversation that followed was unlike anything we had ever shared. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations or denials. Instead, there was a slow, careful excavation of the truth that our marriage had been built on foundations neither of us had fully understood. I told her about the emptiness I had felt for years, about the way I had convinced myself that contentment was the same thing as happiness. I told her about Gabriel, about the conversations that had made me feel alive in ways I had forgotten were possible. I didn't tell her about the physical moments, the touches that had awakened something in me I hadn't known existed. But I told her enough. Enough for her to understand that the man she had married had been hiding fundamental parts of himself, not from malice or deception, but from a fear so deep he hadn't even recognized it as fear. Evelyn listened to all of it with a stillness that was more devastating than anger would have been. When I finally finished talking, she sat quietly for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but hollow. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I've known for months that you were different, distant, but I thought it was work or stress or just getting older. I never imagined it was this." She looked at me then with an expression I had never seen before, something that combined sadness with a kind of terrible clarity. "I feel like I've been married to a ghost," she said. "Like the person I thought I knew never really existed." The accuracy of her observation was brutal. I had been a ghost in my own life, going through the motions of being a husband and father while some essential part of me remained hidden, even from myself. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the devastation in Evelyn's eyes as she recognized the depth of my deception, made the cost of my self-discovery suddenly, overwhelmingly real. That night, I slept on the living room couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Upstairs, Evelyn was probably lying awake too, trying to understand how 22 years of marriage could dissolve in a single conversation. In the days that followed, we moved around each other like careful strangers, maintaining the basic functions of household management while avoiding any conversation that might require genuine interaction. The children seemed to sense that something had shifted, but they were both old enough and busy enough with their own lives that they didn't probe too deeply into the new tension between their parents. I found myself facing an impossible choice. I could try to bury this part of myself again, to convince Evelyn that what had happened with Gabriel was an aberration, a temporary crisis that could be overcome with effort and commitment. I could return to the life I had been living, armed now with the knowledge of what it was costing me, but determined to pay that price for the sake of my family's stability. Or I could step fully into this recognition of who I actually was, knowing that it would destroy the life I had built and hurt people I genuinely loved in ways that could never be completely forgiven. The weight of this decision followed me through every day, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. As I sat in my office processing insurance claims, as I helped Michael research colleges, as I went through the motions of preparing for Christmas with a family that no longer felt quite like my own, I knew that I was living in a kind of suspended animation that couldn't last indefinitely. Something would have to give. The only question was whether I would choose the familiar prison of my old life or the terrifying freedom of whatever came next. The house grew quiet in the weeks after our basement conversation. Not the comfortable quiet of a family at peace, but the heavy silence of people learning to exist around something broken. Evelyn moved through our home like a shadow of herself, her grief sharp but dignified. She performed the necessary tasks of daily life with mechanical precision, but there was something hollow in her movements now, as if some essential part of her had retreated to a place I couldn't reach. The children seemed to sense the fracture. Emma returned to school early, claiming she wanted to get ahead on spring reading. Michael spent most of his time with friends, coming home only to sleep and change clothes. When he was in the house, he moved with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that drawing attention during a crisis was unwise. I continued sleeping on the couch, existing in suspended animation between my old life and whatever came next. The guilt of what I was putting Evelyn through was almost unbearable. She deserved clarity, deserved to know whether she was fighting for a marriage that could still be saved or mourning one that was already over. But I couldn't give her that clarity because I didn't possess it myself. Gabriel, with characteristic patience, gave me the space I needed. When we encountered each other checking mail or in driveways, he was kind but careful, maintaining gentle distance. But I could feel his presence across the street like a gravitational pull, a reminder of the person I became when I was with him, the recognition I had found in his eyes. The decision, when it finally came, was both sudden and inevitable. It was a Tuesday evening in early January, the house settling into its usual rhythm of separate activities and careful silences. Evelyn was in the living room working on a puzzle, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Michael was upstairs on a video call, his laughter occasionally drifting down through the ceiling. I was loading the dishwasher, trying not to think about how this domestic task now felt like a solitary chore performed in the presence of a polite stranger. As I arranged plates in their proper slots, I realized I had been holding my breath for weeks, waiting for something to change, for some external force to make the decision I couldn't make myself. But nothing was going to change unless I changed it. I walked upstairs and pulled a small suitcase from our closet, the same one I used for business trips. I began to pack. Not everything, just enough. A few changes of clothes, some personal items, the things I would need to survive away from this house, while I figured out what came next. My hands were steady as I folded shirts, muscle memory taking over while my mind remained carefully blank. I had no clear plan for where I would go or how I would rebuild my life. All I knew was that I couldn't continue to live divided against myself, couldn't keep asking my family to love a version of me that had never been completely real. When I finished packing, I carried the suitcase downstairs and left it by the front door. Then I walked into the kitchen and performed one last domestic task. I folded the dish towels hanging over the oven handle, smoothing them into the neat rectangles Evelyn preferred, and placed them in the laundry basket. Then I removed my wedding ring, the thin gold band I had worn for 22 years, and placed it carefully beside the basket. It caught the light from the overhead fixture, a small circle of brightness against the dark countertop, insufficient as a symbol for everything I was leaving behind. I didn't write a note. There were no words that could adequately explain what I was doing or make it hurt less. Instead, I simply picked up my suitcase and walked out the front door. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the promise of snow. I stood for a moment on my front porch, looking back at the life I was leaving, trying to memorize the particular way light fell across our living room window, the sound of Michael's laughter still drifting from upstairs. Then I turned and walked across the street. Gabriel answered his door before I could knock, as if he had been watching or somehow sensed my approach. He looked at the suitcase in my hand, then at my face, and stepped aside without speaking to let me enter. The gesture was so simple, so free of questions or conditions, that I almost broke down in his doorway. Instead, I stepped inside and set down my suitcase. We stood there in his front hallway facing each other in the warm light of his house. There was no dramatic embrace, no declaration of love or commitment, no promise about what would happen next. Just two middle-aged men standing in the quiet, acknowledging wordlessly that something fundamental had changed. From somewhere deeper in the house came the familiar sound of his dryer tumbling, that mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack to our tentative courtship. The sound was comforting in its ordinariness, a reminder that even in moments of great change, the basic tasks of living continue. Gabriel reached out and touched my face with the same gentle precision he brought to everything. I leaned into that touch, closing my eyes and feeling something in my chest finally relax for the first time in months. I had chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over security. While I knew the cost would be enormous, while I understood I had hurt people I loved in ways that might never be forgiven, I also knew I could no longer live any other way. The story ends not with triumph, but with stillness, with a man who has finally chosen to inhabit his own life fully, regardless of the price, because he has learned the alternative is a kind of death that touches everything around him. Standing in Gabriel's hallway, listening to the quiet sounds of a house where I was welcome exactly as I was, I felt like I was breathing fully for the first time in decades. Whatever came next would be uncertain, difficult, and probably lonely in ways I couldn't yet imagine. But it would be real. And after so many years of choosing safety over authenticity, that reality felt like the most radical act of love I had ever committed.